Delon. He's from California, and we've been talking about consciousness and how it's fundamental to like pretty much everything, right? I mean, Delon, is that, I don't know, that's probably not the best way to put it. Maybe you want to put it in your own words.
Sure. First of all, hello, Dan, and hello, Bryce. How are you guys doing today?
Oh, man, fantastic.
Thanks for calling in.
Awesome. Yeah, we had been talking about consciousness being irreducible, and that's kind of fundamental. It's kind of like gravity, electromagnetism, something irreducible considered fundamental. And I'd been kicking around the idea of different ways of kind of seeing that.
already with the questions. Yeah, so this is the third time we've actually had this conversation, and it's been a really continuing conversation. Like we've kind of talked about different things. But maybe if you could, can you give like a basic thesis to Bryce, since he hasn't been on before, and maybe for others who haven't caught up?
Sure. So like I've kind of, and I think we were kind of talking about it, maybe not in these exact terms, we were kind of scattered on the conversation, but basically I have 4 axioms to what I guess materialism or really anybody would need to account for to kind of make sense of consciousness. First of all, I would say that the 4 axioms would be structure, information, integration, and exclusion. And it's kind of what I was getting at with the earlier calls is that, first of all, when I mean structured, every experience is different. There's aspects of experience like colors, shapes, etc. And these are the structures of an experience. The second one is information. And what I mean by that is that it's an intrinsic meaning that can differentiate between 2 experiences. For example, it's kind of like frames of a movie. One frame is different to the other. And I think some neuroscientists would tell you that, the moment of an experience lasts for about 1/10 of a second. And there's a lot of different experiences you can have just within 1 second, but that's what I mean by information.
Okay.
And then integration would mean that these experiences are always one thing. It's a non-dual experience. In other words, there's a foreground when you're like for sight, there's a foreground, a background, there's sounds, there's colors.
Okay.
It's all in one experience, like a unity, right?
Okay.
And then the 4th thing would be like an exclusion principle, meaning an experience is only one thing. You're not going to experience things in faster or slower time scales, for example, right?
Okay.
Or you're not going to see, only the left side of something or only the right. It's all unified and binded into a single experience, and it's excluded from anything else. So that's what I mean. And these axioms, if true, mean that whatever's out there must account for these properties: structure, information, integration, and exclusion. And it's kind of hard to talk about because, as me and Dan were going on, it's always kind of a philosophical sort of question,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of weird. So I was thinking today, because I'd been reading and kind of looking at it and trying to figure out how can we talk about it in a different way. And one of the ways that I was thinking was kind of looking at it as the illusion of self. Is very related to that, right? Like, there's a spiritual teaching in Buddhism called anatta. Is anyone familiar with that?
Ooh, maybe. I'm wondering if we could kind of reroute the conversation just a little bit. And it's not that this isn't interesting, but I think the claim that was central that we were kind of focusing on, and I want to bring Bryce into this conversation because he was already asking questions. I think your central claim that you brought in was consciousness was a fundamental property of the universe.
Yep.
Yeah, and I want to like let Bryce maybe tackle that a little bit because it sounds like he's ready to go.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
great.
So just a few questions here. So the way that it sounds like you described it with your 4 proposed axioms, I don't know if those are philosophically agreed upon axioms, but it sounds like you're proposing them as possibles. when it comes to consciousness, it seems like the proposition that you're providing is completely binary. Either something is conscious or something is not conscious. And that because consciousness exists, therefore it is axiomatic that it is a constant in the universe. So I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I do take an issue with considering consciousness as binary of something is or is not conscious, because consciousness has so many things built into it. So I guess I would ask then, if you were provided examples of things that are on a consciousness spectrum, not completely conscious, not completely unconscious, but there's an entire spectrum of consciousness, would that change your understanding or your beliefs in this universal constant that you claim has these four axiomatic principles?
So I guess what you're asking is, or maybe can you restate that a little bit? I think I know what you mean, but I want to make sure I answer it correctly here.
Yeah. So let me just provide an example. So
Sure.
What it sounds like is this is an anthropocentric view of what consciousness is. We are humans. We view consciousness. Humans are conscious. But if I showed you a different life form that has a different degree of consciousness, then would that change your understanding or your beliefs about consciousness?
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. So I actually agree with that 100%. In fact, I believe that consciousness is non-reducible, and it's actually can be looked at as something fundamental, meaning there's this idea of emergence, or even better, epiphenomenal emergence, which is that, if only you combine enough of the right that matter together in just the right way, that voila, you get genie out of the bottle, right? And that's more of a materialistic sort of explanation. But what I'm kind of kicking around is the idea that consciousness actually goes all the way down. In other words, maybe not in the way that humans are conscious, but perhaps there's different levels of consciousness that can be quantified one day. That, this is kind of a typical idea in AI research. And I kind of feel that would be a good way to explain emergence a lot better than, trying to utilize or appeal to a combination problem, because that's kind of a fallacy to think that if you just combine enough matter in just the right way, that something like consciousness would arise that way.
So let me dive into that a little bit further, if you don't mind. So as far as let's try and focus on the concept of consciousness being irreducible. And if something is irreducible, then it seems like even if it exists on a continuum, then you degrade, you reduce it to the point that it gets to the end of that continuum. And then that is the point of irreducibility at the very bottom of that continuum, right? So if we have, let's say, humans are X level of consciousness, and then, other sapient and sentient creatures like, dolphins or raccoons or other monkeys are somewhere around that similar level of consciousness where they can recognize themselves in a mirror, they can understand their own body parts, and they have a sense of proprioception. And we look at the degree, maybe a few degrees down, like a cat isn't as sentient or sapient as a human being, right? And if we're using those as our criteria for claiming something as conscious, then a cat is less conscious than a human being is. Right. So we can continue to walk down this continuum in degrees to the point that we are reducing the criteria of what is considered consciousness to the point that we get to what? Single-celled organisms that have no sense of proprioception, they have no intelligence, they have no anything that we would consider a conscious being would have. But at what point do you reduce something to the point that you can?
Right. That's the hard problem of consciousness, where you draw the line. One of the examples in nature that you look at, you were talking about one-celled sort of creatures or something like that. If you look at slime mold is really interesting. It acts intelligently. It solves problems. It remembers things. It even acts irrationally. It has a lot of cognitive functions. Now, the problem with that is it's kind of hard to say whether it's conscious, depending on what we mean by conscious. But on the other hand, I really can't say 100% that you are conscious or my dog is conscious, right? Because it's a subjective thing. What we can do, though, is we can make these correlations with behavior. If a thing is acting intelligently, if it's aware of its environment, internally, externally, it's reasonable to conclude that it has at least some measure of this thing we're calling consciousness. So, following that logic, just trying to be consistent, when I look at something like a slime mold or amoeba, these, cells, these bacteria, viruses, they all sort of act in the same manner. Where do we draw the line? I don't know. I don't know if you can. Perhaps I was kind of mentioning before, perhaps beyond the behavior, it would be maybe a principle that just like everything else in the universe, all matter and energy has a principle or some sort of probability distribution of making these things true. I think you get down into quantum mechanics and you get down into all these type of things. These probabilities kind of give rise to the reality that we see, that we experience, and that we observe. Perhaps that same principle is somewhere embedded way down into the fine structures of space-time. I don't know. I know that there are people like Roger Penrose. He's like, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's like a super mathematician and physicist, Nobel Prize winner. He actually kind of feels that consciousness may be something like that it may be part of that whole thing. And it kind of explains the observer effect, maybe not in the way that the Copenhagen interpretation may, interpret that. But there's all sorts of ideas out there that really smarter guys than me that are kicking around, they're really interested. And so I just kind of see that it kind of makes sense to me, because at least you kind of get out of that categorical error of just thinking magically that, consciousness experience is real. Does it just come about magically by combining enough dumb things together? I mean, that just kind of doesn't do it for me. I'm not saying that it's not, that's not the case.
Yeah, that's kind of, that's really, really interesting that you word it that way, because I think we kind of talked about this last week as well, because I think we do know that there are some things that do happen as emergent properties, right? Like we talked about oxygen and hydrogen atoms on their own, not necessarily being wet, but like together in a certain structure, they have the property of like wetness. I can't quite remember what your response was to that, but it seems strange to me that you would rule that out as a possibility of conscious. And you also mentioned earlier that consciousness is subjective, as if we don't have some sort of like metric to understand what consciousness is. And I think that is also, I mean, like you gave a list of examples of what it could be, but it almost seems strange to me to say that if consciousness is subjective to some degree, if we don't have some sort of criteria, then I don't know how we could say that there is a fundamental aspect to it, because saying that there's a fundamental aspect to it kind of doesn't make it subjective anymore. It kind of makes it something that we can recognize as objective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, that's the hard problem. That's part of it. It's a difference between maybe a panpsychic view of fundamental consciousness and an idealistic sort of way of viewing it. But I guess to clarify, like to say, there's two ways to look at it. Like, for example, when my tooth hurts, I have a feeling of pain, right? Now that's different from the neural mechanisms that might give rise to the pain, right?
Why is that?
Those are two different things.
What makes that different?
They relate to each other. But what bridges them together is this idea of information, which is fundamental to everything that really we call existing. So this information transfer is the difference between, the C fibers firing and the actual experience. The experience is what I mean by the subjective part.
Okay, so like the qualia almost.
Yeah, the qualia. There you go.
Okay.
The qualia.
All right, I think Bryce had some questions he wanted to ask as well.
Yeah, so sure. I want to be very careful about the definitions we're using here, and I hope that I can get you to define your definitions a little bit here, because it seems a few minutes ago when you were talking about the consciousness basically being the underpinnings of the universe, I wonder if you can help us define your concept of consciousness a little bit better, because it seems like the way that it's been thrown around in this conversation, that it has been used,
I know.
It's a term that's been applied to a lot of different things. So I'm kind of having a hard time using such an unwieldy word for the purpose of the conversation.
It's so slippery.
Yeah. Can you just define consciousness kind of in your own terms, without, walking us through your 4 logic arguments of why you think it is an axiom?
Consciousness for me is experience, like what it's like to be something. That experience in and of itself. That's what I mean by consciousness. If I talk about, when we get into talking about thinking and intelligence, these are sort of like modes of consciousness. And these are what I guess philosophers call the easy problem. Not that they're really easy. I mean, that's kind of a slap in the face to a lot of people that work hard on these things. But those are the easy problems. We can kind of make those correlations, and they're really helpful. But what's the hard problem? What's considered the hard problem is the experience. Like, why should there be an experience when C fibers fire up, right? All this stuff could necessarily go on in the dark, like a computer.
Let's explore that. Let's explore that because I think that's an interesting question of experience, because I think experience in and of itself is a completely different word than consciousness. But the way that it's like you're using it is that experience is one aspect of consciousness. If there were something that it could be shown that it is experiencing something, but doesn't have the sentience to realize that it's experiencing that thing, is that still consciousness? And I can provide an example if you'd like.
Right. So experience seems like, when I really think about it, it seems to be a neutral thing. It seems to kind of be the screen on which the movie plays, right? And it's, like a philosophical zombie, right? Could be reacting to its environment, maybe like an AI machine, a computer. We don't know if they have any kind of subjective experience of what it's like. I just think that if there's behavior, the best I can do to be consistent, at least, is suppose that there is some sort of experience in relation to the properties, to the physical properties that we can measure. We can measure those because it happens within myself, right? So maybe that's a better way to kind of describe it. I don't know if that's exactly what you're pointing at.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to a little bit more drill down on exactly then how we define consciousness, because by your previous definition, you said it's the experience that something has. But if I can propose the example of if I have the experience of rolling down a hill, I'm going to recognize that this is unpleasant. I'm going to get dirty. Yeah. I'm going to bump my arms and legs, bump my head on stuff. I'm going to recognize that is an unpleasant experience. But a rock rolling down the hill, in and of itself, the rock doesn't recognize what it's experiencing. But an outside observer can understand that the rock, if it were a sentient or a sapient conscious being, that it's going through an experience of some sort. Yes. So by that term alone, I think experience is a very hard word to conflate, even because it introduces so much subjectivity. And when we're trying to define consciousness in and of itself, there's so many things that are wrapped up into it that I'm just having a hard time understanding exactly what definition you're trying to use. What would be a synonym that you would use for the way that you're using the term consciousness right now?
Yeah, and let me comment on this just a little bit, because I think we also need to clarify when we're talking about consciousness, and if we make sweeping claims like everything is consciousness, well, suddenly, if everything is consciousness, then we have no way of determining what is conscious and what's non-conscious. And if we believe that something is like non-conscious, then how we suddenly don't have a method to determine what is and isn't. It kind of reminds me of this way.
That's huge right there.
Yeah.
That's a huge misunderstanding, and I probably should make that really clear too.
Mm-hmm.
So by saying that I view consciousness as fundamental or irreducible, I am not really saying that everything is conscious. That's just not true. That's not. Even panpsychists don't say that, or even idealists don't necessarily say that.
You're kind of saying that everything has the fundamental properties by which something could potentially be
could be.
conscious.
The potential is all. There's a principle embedded in reality that if things were, if there's a system that has a causal effect on itself, as well as the outside world, and mainly it's itself, then that thing could be said to be conscious.
Okay, so that's
integrating information is where I get that.
Okay, I see that. There's an observation that I see. Everything I've ever observed to be conscious or have the properties of conscious has been biological and has been structured in a certain way, has had particular kinds of atoms, and has always been arranged in a particular way. I've never seen consciousness outside of these particular structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that almost says, well, if consciousness isn't separate from these structures, then what reason do I have to believe that consciousness exists outside of these structures as far as an emergent property? Now, I know that's not a perfect argument, right? And I'm not necessarily trying to make an argument, but this is just based on observation. If we're talking about things that have the capacity to be conscious, then I would say that there might be certain things which have never demonstrated themselves to have the capacity to be conscious. So I wouldn't understand how I could make the claim that everything could be conscious. Does that make sense?
Right. So let's take another example of something fundamental. Let's look at gravity.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to see gravity's effects everywhere. You're only going to see it in relative examples. Gravity is, when you have mass plus the distance of another object, then you can kind of measure the effect of the gravity that exists, right?
Yeah.
But it's considered a fundamental thing in nature. It's just a feature of reality, right?
Okay.
So in that sense, it's not that, and you can even tweak gravity. You can even change it. You can even mess with it. You can do all kinds of things. The same thing with consciousness. You can tweak your consciousness. If I drink too many beers, my consciousness is definitely going to change, right?
So we do change gravity, but by changing gravity, we have to change like the mass of something, right? Like we are changing the structures that are like interacting with each other almost.
Exactly. There's one thing that never changes, and that's the principle of gravity itself. We don't just get rid of gravity. We don't. That doesn't happen. And I think with consciousness, it's kind of the same thing. It's like electromagnetism. Wherever it's conducive, you're going to see the effects. But that principle exists as a feature of our reality. And I think that consciousness is a feature of our reality. It's possible for things to be conscious if combined the right way, if the systems are sophisticated enough, or if they have some sort of causal effect. they can emerge just like anything. And really, I've always wondered after I've kind of thought about it, it shouldn't really be that controversial of an idea.
Maybe. I want to let Bryce talk about this a little bit more, but
sure.
I also know that there are particles in nature that aren't affected by gravity. So to say,
yes.
So to say that it's fundamental that gravity is a fundamental part of like everything, it would almost be wrong. Like a photon, for example, isn't as well. Actually, I think photons are affected by gravity. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a physicist, right? But okay, so like as an example, if I could demonstrate something, is there a way, a method that we could use to demonstrate that something is or is not fundamental to consciousness? Because I think that's the only way we can really ever know if this hypothesis you're saying is true.
Exactly. Oddly enough, I read an article just today. It's kind of weird that this comes up, but it's a new article, and you might want to check it out. Maybe the listeners can check it out. But it's basically what happened is there's this AI computer, and what's happened is subjects will lay in an fMRI machine, and they'll look at images, right? Now, this fMRI machine is measuring brain waves, and it's actually sending the brain waves down a wire, right? And it's being received by an AI computer on the other end. And the way that this AI machine works is by reconstructing in the exact fashion that a human brain reconstructs information when it perceives something. It says it just like that explicitly in this article. And it came about because former President Obama started this whole brain mapping project a few years ago. And so the brain has been fully mapped and fully, as far as the processes, just kind of mapped out. And they utilize those same, logical instructions in this program that the AI uses, to reconstruct images that are sent down the wire. And so it produces these images onto a screen, onto a monitor. You can actually go on the internet and you can look at how it's looking at people's thoughts. And so one of the researchers, I forget exactly what article I read that, but he was saying that basically that kind of points to consciousness or perception being informational, right? That all you really need is a structure that can process the information sufficiently, like a brain or a computer, or it really doesn't matter what the structure is. As long as it can process that information, it can have a flash of an experience. So they're kind of thinking that this AI machine is actually having a moment of an experience because it's actually mimicking exactly what the human subject is doing when they see the image. So it kind of opens up a philosophical question. Of course, you're not inside the mind of the AI machine to know that. But if it were true, and they're kind of exploring it to kind of look to make sure that they can maybe quantify that somehow. And if that's true, then it kind of substantiates what I'm saying here, that it's, consciousness is also information. Information is basically everything. I mean, that's basically what the universe is made of.
Okay. A lot of stuff going on here.
And actually, one thing that we have effectively done throughout this conversation is dabble into entire fields of scientific research that have been constructed for hundreds of years and been theorized and tested. And I think it's clear that none of the three of us have any expertise in most of the fields that we've been pulling information and dabbling into here. So I actually want to take an opportunity to rewind back to 20 minutes ago and say, so
So
Dylan,
very quickly, before you go on, I just want to let everybody know that we still have open lines on the calls, folks, and we really want to take more calls. I'd like to try to wrap up this conversation because we've been kind of going on for a little bit now, and I'd like to get more calls to go in. But yeah, definitely, please call in the line if you can. So anyway, continue.
Feel free to cut me off when I ask this question here, Dan. But I was just going to say, Delon, if you could plant your flag on what your belief is when you're constructing all of these I don't know how to say it, but the very cumbersome, very weighty arguments to try and understand consciousness. If you had to stake your flag on your belief of what consciousness is, how would you summarize that? How would you say that in a succinct sentence?
Yeah, I'll make it really quick. I would say that my belief is that consciousness is probably defined or described better by panpsychism. There's different versions of panpsychism, so I don't want to get into all that, but basically that principally consciousness is a feature of our universe, fundamentally. It doesn't happen everywhere. I'm not saying that when we die, our consciousness continues. I'm not saying any of that. I don't think that's true for 1 minute. But I'm just saying that, consciousness, just like gravity, just like electromagnetism, spin, charge, you name it, I think it's part of that. I'm kind of leaning towards that. I'm not 100% certain, of course. I don't want to be a deluded person. So I'm kind of leaning maybe 60% to that belief.
So I don't know anything about panpsychism. It sounds very interesting, and it sounds like a very weighty term, like it has a lot of faceted pieces that require understanding. But if you own a different model that would express or that would show where consciousness comes from that does not comport with panpsychism, then would you be willing to change your beliefs on where you think consciousness comes from?
Oh yeah, 100%. 100%. I'm like you guys, truth wanted. I'm not married to a belief necessarily. Everyone has opinions, and there's good opinions, there are bad ones. I try to make good opinions and informed opinions, and that's what it's based on. But I also know that I can be wrong, of course, and I've been wrong before, so I would be glad to be wrong, actually.
There you go. What an answer. I like that.
That is a fantastic answer.
Yeah.
Good. Keep seeking the truth, whatever it may lead us.
Well, Delon, you have been a faithful caller to the show. This is your third call in. And hey, let me ask you this. Next time you call in, you think we could talk about something else besides consciousness?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's not an interesting topic, but I'd love to see what else you believe, man, because I'm sure you have some other stuff we could talk about.
Another one. I've got a few things. We can talk free will.
Oh my goodness.
What is the self? Oh man, it goes on.
You're an astute. You're a scholar and a saint, as they say.
Well, thank you, sir.
I really appreciate it, and I really want to talk to you again sometime. Thanks again for calling, man.
You got it, brothers. Y'all have a good one.
All right, we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Man, fun stuff.
Yeah, that was honestly, that was very challenging to. I mean, I felt like I was clinging on to the edge of that conversation with my white knuckle fingertips because it was accelerating so fast into the next subject. And I enjoy those conversations, and it depends on who you're talking to, whether or not those conversations are completely futile or they're interesting. And that was really quite interesting. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Yeah, I bet that wasn't the first call you'd expect to get today on this show. But this show, it throws some curveballs at you. Let me tell you, that's the third time that we've talked about this. And, gosh, there's so many angles you can go at it with this. Right. Here's my brief summary of what I think about this entire conversation, because Dinesh D'Souza is a guy that I've heard say this as well, that like consciousness is fundamental, and like there's kind of a woo factor in there for me. And the biggest thing is like, okay, so like atoms are fundamental for like bodies, right? And for like things, I guess. And I get that because they're like matter, but like when you start talking about consciousness, it's hard to put a label like that on things because
and where I think it kind of breaks down is what fundamental in and of itself is a pretty loaded term, because fundamental it necessarily means that whatever piece you're talking about, the fundamental piece of that whole is required in order for the whole to be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, yes, consciousness exists in our universe. Therefore, by that definition, it is fundamental. It is a fundamental piece of the universe. But I don't think that the universe cares that there are conscious actors within it.
Yeah.
So it's not like the universe requires consciousness to exist. It just so happens that consciousness does exist and is therefore a fundamental piece of the universe.
Yes, for sure. I feel the exact same way. It's kind of like saying telephones are fundamental to existence because things can be eventually made into telephones or something. I don't know if that's the best analogy, but it's saying that something is part of the system doesn't mean that it's fundamental to the system, I think is like the most basic way I would put it.
But the best part about that whole call was that he said, we walked through all of these points, and then by the end of it, he says, well, I'm X percentage certain that this is a way to understand consciousness, but I'm totally okay with being completely wrong about that. And I'm just, just like you guys, truth is wanted. So I don't know. I think that's an extremely healthy way to just approach everything, because he was introducing concepts that my mind cannot even begin to grasp the subjects that are built into each subject.
Yeah. Skepticism is a virtue, that gets tossed around.
It's a pursuit.
Yes. Man, that harkens me back to I'm stalling right now, folks, because we're waiting on some callers to come on in. So if you want to call in, go ahead and call. But it harkens me back to the conversations we had. I don't know because the Mormon view on souls is very different from the Christian view on souls and how that works. But it does remind me of this kind of conversation of souls being fundamental to the human person, essentially.
Right.
And you hear this come up with abortion debates and all kinds of stuff. And that always, even as a child, that really confused me as far as how the ensoulation process works. Does the soul exist before a human does? And what does it even mean to say that someone has a soul and someone doesn't? It's a crazy conversation.
It is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you are, if we're needing to fill a little bit more airtime, like when I had you onto my live stream on the Name of Home Evening, you can find that on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel. I tried my very best to defend Joseph Smithicism. I claim that Joseph Smith is a mythical figure, and that was fun. But it's not something that I actually truly believe. It's not something that we could dig into very deeply just because we were just having fun, right?
Yes, that was so interesting, though. You defend, I'm not a Mormon, right? So I can't verify all the facts that you were giving at that time, but that was really interesting. For those of you who don't know or haven't seen it, you should definitely go check it out on Bryce Blankenagel's channel. But basically, we had this conversation where Bryce pretended that Joseph Smith was a mythical figure created by Brigham Young, who is another early member of the Mormon Church. And he gave this very, very detailed explanation on why he thinks that is. And I had this conversation with him with two other ex-Mormons. And I think the two other ex-Mormons were much more interested in the details you could come up with. And I was more interested in how the heck did you get to this conclusion? Totally. It's kind of crazy.
Well, and if I can draw a bit of a parallel to somebody like Deepak Chopra or Dinesh D'Souza, what I was able to do was understand where the Socratic method was going to come in and understand where I didn't have an argument. And I was able to continue to pile on the facts and information and continue introducing new rabbit trails to the point that we never really got to that fundamental question of, okay, what degree of certainty do you have that Joseph Smith was a mythical person?
Yes.
And I was able to completely keep you off of examining the entire thing as a whole through a critical and skeptical mind, which I think is much the way that, like, when Deepak Chopra starts talking about the quantum fluctuations, that our consciousness is a manifestation of so on and so forth, and all of the, I mean, it's hard to distinguish between the Deepak Chopra generator website that's just a satire of him as opposed to his actual talks. But it's just knowing enough large words and knowing enough little tiny factoids or snippets and interweaving them into an entire field of woo, constructing a web of woo that's strung together with little facts. It made it so that we were very hard pressed to find a point to drill down on whether or not I believe or to what degree of certainty I have that belief in.